Program Professor Vali Nasr. He is the Majid Kaduri Professor of Middle East Studies and International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So let's just start. I mean, I think most people by now have at least some passing familiarity with the name Qasem Soleimani. But tell us who he was, and also who Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was, who was also killed in this drone attack.
So Qasem Soleimani became a known name in the West after U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, when he emerged in Iraq as the mastermind of Iran's policy there, the man who initially organized the militias that ultimately would attack U.S. forces in Iraq, and also became a power broker, basically bringing together the different Shia factions in order to put together different governments and bring to power different prime ministers in Iraq. And then it became quite obvious to us that his purview of his activities was all the way from Lebanon to Afghanistan. In a sense, he was the commander of Iran's regional forces and regional presence. And he proved quite adept at that. He not only managed Iraq, but also he eventually became the singular important force in sustaining the Assad regime in power. He reputedly, personally persuaded President Putin to bring Russia into Syria. And then he also became a very known figure in Iraq, both in northern Iraq and southern Iraq, during the fight against ISIS. But in the West, he came to be known particularly for attacks on American troops. He came to be sort of the face of the Islamic Republic's most sort of aggressive regional policies against the U.S. and also other regional actors. And he became associated with terrorism in the region, with what happened in Syria, and he had become an iconic figure in American imagination.
And from the perspective of Iran and Iranians, how did they perceive him? I mean, what would be the analog, I guess, for an American audience?
Well, regardless of what Iranians think about the Revolutionary Guards, the security forces, the Islamic Republic itself, Soleimani personally was very popular in Iran. At least in polling that had been done, he came up with over 90% approval rating at times as the single most popular figure in Iran, to the point that actually rumors began spreading of a political career for him as a future president in Iran. Iranians saw him essentially as sort of a maverick figure that was defending Iran's national security, particularly because he was not responsible for domestic oppression. He was rather engaged in defending Iranian interests in Syria or Iraq and or Lebanon, and so he did have a cult following, I would say, within the Revolutionary Guards, within the hardline sector in Iran, but had much broader appeal across the gamut of public opinion in Iran.
Okay, and the second man, I guess, was a close advisor of Soleimani. That is Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Can you tell us about him?
Well, we don't know much about his sort of biography. What is important? I mean, Soleimani had been grooming militia commanders, sort of analogs to Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah in Lebanon. In other words, once Iran set up proxy militias, there was always a local commander, local enforcer who was managing that group, and Mohandes was in that capacity. So he was a senior militia commander in Iraq, worked with Soleimani very closely, was very instrumental on the ground in Iraq in terms of implementing Iran's projects there. And he's not the most well-known or senior militia commander in Iraq, but he was an important figure, at least in one of the key militias that was responsible for hitting the U.S. base, and then the U.S. retaliated against it, and then this militia was instrumental in charging the U.S. embassy a few days ago. So he's an Iraqi figure. If he had been killed on his own, it would have been big news in Iraq, but it would not have had the broader global attention that the killing of Soleimani brought about. He's a much, much lesser figure, localized to Iraqi politics and Iraqi security.
I may be getting ahead here because I want to talk about the implications for what it means for protests in Iraq that have been taking place and protests that have been taking place in Iran and reformers, particularly in Iran, but since we're in this place, what are the chances, from your perspective, that our intention was not to kill Soleimani, but was rather to kill Muhandis as a sort of a more proportionate response to attacks that have been taking place in Iraq, and Donald Trump or the U.S. or somewhere along the line, someone got played about the information and the intelligence that we received?
Possible. We really don't know, but that's not what U.S. has claimed. The Pentagon, I believe, has said that Soleimani was killed under direct orders of President Trump. There has not been any kind of disavowing that the fact that he was a target. So ultimately, it's the public display of what happens that will politically matter. So within Iran or within Iraq, within the American political system, the reaction to this will be decided by what people are told publicly, by what the governments claim publicly. We might have had a different reaction had the U.S. administration come out and said that they were targeting Mohandes and that Soleimani was a lucky collateral damage. That at least would have left sort of some diplomatic wiggle room to say that the U.S. did not directly target the most senior sort of Iranian commander, the famous figures, potentially the second most well-known Iranian sort of statesman as known in the region directly, right, and that this was not a decapitation mission against Iran. That might have had a very different implication. But the U.S. The president basically claimed that he directly ordered the killing of an Iranian senior official. So Iranians will read it at face value. They cannot do otherwise. Right. And so will Americans, so will Iraqis, so will everybody else in the region.
Okay, and so explain this dynamic. I mean, this is, perhaps sort of a generic question about international relations. But at this point, the fact that it's made public and that it's embraced by the United States, this killing, this assassination, just talk about the physics. Like, how compelled now is Iran to respond, and to what extent can we get a notion of what they think will be enough of a response to satiate the need to respond with their domestic for their domestic constituencies?
Well, that's exactly, I think, what they're considering right now. Today, there was supposed to be a Supreme National Security meeting in Iran to decide on the response. A lot of this is really a power play. Both sides have domestic constituencies. The president of the United States wants to show bravado before the American public in an election year before impeachment, wants to show the region that the U.S. is going to stand tough. The Iranians similarly cannot get a bloody nose without reacting. I don't think either side wants war, but they've got a lot closer to it, and they're going to be goaded into this by the action and reaction cycle here. I mean, regardless of what the administration claims, the killing of Soleimani is not going to thwart whatever plans were in train for attacking U.S. bases and U.S. personnel. I mean, Soleimani was not the personal assassin that was going to show up at the base and shoot a rocket.
Right.
Whatever he had put in play will continue. And the U.S. didn't actually hit a base or a group of implementers. They hit the mastermind. So this was much more of a symbolic kill, if you would. than an actually operational one. And both now that President Trump has locked himself into this sort of aggressive response, and in a similar way, the Iranians will be locked as well. Now, whether they retaliate next week or whether they retaliate in a month, that remains to be seen. But I think the Iranians also are seeing tremendous benefit in this. It's going to galvanize Iraq against the United States. It's going to divert attention from the anti-Iranian protests that were raging there. Internally, within Iran, is going to create a rally to the flag effect. It's going to create sympathy for the ruling regime, and it's very convenient for them to divert attention from what happened in Iran in the past 2-3 months, protests, mass killings. So in a way, actually, there are also opportunities for Iran, and Iran's going to milk that, both regionally and domestically.
So, in other words, to the extent that there was any type of momentum or protest or reformers were gaining any type of power in Iran, for people who were in Iran who were encouraging, I guess a measured response to what the United States, and I want to talk just briefly about this, is done in terms of the nuclear accord. They have been disempowered.
That's all gone.
They have been disempowered. Okay.
They have been already. They were being disempowered because of President Trump came out of the nuclear deal. But look, any political system is not very different than our own. I mean, in the United States, there's always a rumor that going to war is a case of a tail wagging the dog. That president's election years may look for October surprise or may look for some kind of a national security crisis that brings everybody behind the president and diverts attention from domestic politics. So Iran's no different from that. I mean, if the Iranian government sees an opportunity to sideline the moderates, but also to sort of divert attention domestically from domestic issues about economics, hardship, repression, unhappiness with the regime, and focus everybody on this confrontation with the U.S. So in that sense, it's going to be consequential. And similarly in Iraq, I mean, it's the militia types that are now going to have the momentum in not only choosing the next prime minister of Iraq, as that's going to be taking place, but also perhaps enforcing the parliament in Iraq to demand that the United States leave the country.
So, I mean, even from the perspective of what supposedly we are led to believe the national security establishment of this country would want in terms of outcomes in Iraq and in Iran, is there any, what would be the rationale of doing this beyond, I guess, an ability to say that we could do it and a hope that it doesn't end up spiraling out of control?
I don't see it. I mean, I really don't see a clear strategy behind the entire way in which the past 2 years President Trump has handled Iran. He took a situation that was fairly stable. I mean, Iran and the United States, at least, had for the first time signed the deal. It might not be a perfect deal, but they signed it. Iran implemented it. Iranians were not shooting rockets at American bases in Iraq. We were in a much better position than we are today. So he taken what was a relatively stable situation, and he has created a crisis out of it, and he's not showing a way how he's going to get out of it. There's no exit ramp here, and that's extremely dangerous. So I think, if anything, once we sort of settle down from the American ability to carry out something like this and the president's sort of machismo, the begging question is, where do we go from here, and why did you bring us to this point?
Okay. Lastly, do you have a sense of what type of responses are on the table? I mean, potentially from an Iranian perspective, because I presume that what they need to do is calibrate a response that they hope will not escalate, but will satiate a domestic demand for in terms of showing that they're strong.
So, we always can look back at what they had done historically, like bomb an embassy, attack an embassy, blow up something. But they may also surprise us, just like they did when they went after the oil facilities in the Gulf. They also may mobilize mass protests across the region and force the United States to confront people on the streets, as we saw in Iraq. I think that's exactly why they're taking their time discussing this, because there's not necessarily an easy, obvious next step for them. They know they have to do something, but you're right. They have to also calibrate and sit down and think what their next step ought to be.
Well,
I've got to run on.
Okay, yes. Well, Vali Nasr, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.